At a time when the COVID-19 pandemic has raised issues of welfare regimes higher up the global agenda, author Ferdinand Eibl discusses his book, Social Dictatorships, the Political Economy of the Welfare State in the Middle East and North Africa. Using mixed methods of study, the book presents an explanation as to why social spending in authoritarian regimes differ, and presents case studies of the political origins of the Tunisian and Egyptian welfare state. Interviewing Ferdinand is IDS Research Fellow Max Gallien.
Welcome, Ferdinand. Thank you so much for making the time to speak about a topic which has become somewhat unfortunately quite timely given the ongoing corona pandemic. We'll get to that in a little bit, but I think it would make sense to kind of talk a bit more broadly about welfare states in the Middle East, and then kind of move on to kind of present day questions in the second half of the podcast. The thing that really struck me and that I would want to start with was that for anyone who's done research in the Middle East, and especially on the politics of the Middle East, one thing that's really striking is that welfare state issues, and particularly education and health coverage, are really, really common issues, really hot button issues in day-to-day political discussions within the region. And yet they're oddly absent from a lot of political science scholarship. And I was wondering, A, where do you think that strange gap is coming from, and what got you to a position to begin to fill it with social dictatorships?
Yeah, well, first of all, Max, thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure to be able to talk about my book, and then also later on to talk a little bit about the book in the context of COVID-19. So thanks for having me. Well, to your question, I mean, you're absolutely right. The social policies are woefully neglected in the scholarship on the Middle East, and that really contrasts to scholarship, say, on Latin America, where you could easily fill at least an aisle in a library with books on social policies from various perspectives, economists, political scientists, anthropologists, and so on and so forth. I mean, I think this neglect in sort of the study of the Middle East comes down to a few factors. Well, first of all, in terms of the way Middle East scholars have been trained, there's traditionally been a huge emphasis on language, which is absolutely right, the acquisition of Arabic or Farsi or Hebrew, whatever, as your main tool. But that then obviously kind of makes you more likely to pick up certain research topics, or maybe also certain research methodologies, to use interviews, to study textual sources. And that can then lead to neglect of, say, more political economy type topics. And I think somewhat related to this, Middle Eastern studies has also been dominated by a few kind of, if you will, bread and butter issues that the region has kind of produced. So, for instance, the study of political Islam. I mean, there's so much scholarship on this, an amazing scholarship on this, and I think people have kind of ventured into this because they thought they have a comparative advantage here relative to scholars working on other regions, and this is related to, I think, a third point, which has to do with the kind of geopolitical context in which Middle East scholarship, at least Western Middle Eastern scholarship, occurs. I mean, traditionally, scholarship on the MENA region has been shaped a lot by geopolitical interests, by the topics that kind of Western countries are interested in from a point of view of maybe controlling the region, or at least better understanding, managing the region, quote unquote. So that means that a lot of the MENA scholarship is highly securitized and looks at issues such as wars, civil wars, sectarianism, Islamism itself, terrorism, and all of these things kind of come from this, I think, legacy, but also ongoing shaping of geopolitical interests in Middle East scholarship. Now, I mean, I came then to this sort of basically from the realization that there is a huge gap, and I thought this is my comparative advantage. So I realized, I remember that there was a book on the political economy of the welfare state in Latin America by Segura Obiergo, published I think 2007. And I thought, that's the type of book that I want to write. And that's the type of book I wish existed on the Middle East, but it didn't. And so in a way I ended up writing it. I don't know, other people will have to judge to what extent this is you know, a good approach, or you know, this was at least sort of my trajectory into the topic.
Well, having had the enormous pleasure of reading it, I thought it was really, really striking, not just by filling a gap that was obvious in the field and striking in the field, but because it highlighted the enormous diversity of welfare trajectories in the region. It tackled some of the kind of common assumptions that, partly due to the lack of scholarship, have been endlessly repeated around, you know, welfare state spending in early Nasserist Egypt. It highlighted some of the things that were commonly overlooked, such as Tunisia. But what I found really, really striking is that it doesn't just provide patterns and kind of stylized groupings of diverging welfare state regimes in the region, but it also really tries to tackle at the historical origins of these and try to get at the key factors that have driven this divergence. Could you give listeners a really, really brief rundown of some of the key factors that you see have driven welfare state provision in the region in such dramatically divergent trajectories?
Yeah, I mean, what I came to realize when I started my research is that, well, first of all, as you rightly say, there is this huge divergence of outcomes, which we, to some extent, scholarship wasn't necessarily aware of, just because some countries are understudied, or we had sort of not necessarily the right data to put things into comparative perspective. And then, you know, as I tried to figure out you know, what the factors were that explained this divergence, I literally had to trace the data, the spending data that I started with backwards to figure out when did actually this divergence occur. And this is what pointed me to processes of regime formation. I'm not sure I would necessarily say they always coincide with state formation, because, for instance, Egyptian state formation precedes the Nasser area. You know, it's a longer ongoing process, but definitely regime formation is something that is incredibly powerful as a critical moment, as a crucible in order to you know, bring about these long-lasting institutional arrangements. So, in a nutshell, my argument rests on two pillars. One is the type of ruling coalitions that authoritarian regimes end up with, and then the context in which they operate. And so when ruling coalitions are broad, elites have an inherent incentive to distribute welfare broadly and also generously, and narrow support coalitions that are mainly composed of elites don't have this incentive. And you know, here I don't reinvent the wheel, as it were. I sort of rely on scholarship that has pointed to important, you know, determinants of broad versus narrow coalitions. For instance, intra-elite conflict has been highlighted in scholarship such as Waldner's and so on, so forth, as an important determinant. What I do is I refine this a little bit, because I think intra-elite conflict is just can be a very vague category. So what I argue is that intra-elite conflict becomes very important when it can't be repressed and it can't be reconciled. And so this is why, for instance, in some cases in my book, such as Pahlavi Iran, you see that there was important intra-elite conflict, but because one side had higher repressive capacity than the other one, either because they, you know, the way the intra-elite conflict occurred split the repressive apparatus very unevenly, and basically all the armed forces sided with one side, or there was an external patron available, such as in the case of Iran, where the Pahlavi regime relied on Britain and the US to overthrow the nationalist threat. Whenever this was possible, this kind of incentive to broaden the coalition was undermined. And similarly, you see salient communal cleavages also tend to undermine these broad coalitions. So once these coalitions are in place, what then matters is the context in which regimes operate. And here, what I really want to emphasize in the book is that the geostrategic and geoeconomic context in which regimes operate determines not only patterns of, say, war and alliances, but also very much bread and butter domestic politics, such as social policies. So whenever regimes, take for instance the Nasser regime, faced strong external threats, in this case in the form of Israel, there was an acute trade-off between spending on the armed forces and spending on domestic issues. And the regime perceived these trade-offs as such, and perceived them as acute and something that needed to be addressed. And whenever there's no resources available, you know, in the Middle East, the main abundant resource to overcome this issue is oil, but it could in theory be other resources. But if there's no resource endowment available to kind of overcome this trade-off between butter and guns, regimes end up with a broad welfare state, but not necessarily a broad and generous welfare state. So you end up sort of in a world where you have three types of welfare states in the region: the broad and generous ones, where you have broad coalitions that weren't impeded by sort of the geostrategic context, or regimes that could overcome this trade-off between butter and guns because they had oil and a big resource endowment. Those that had an incentive to spend on social welfare, but they really couldn't overcome this trade-off, and they end up with a broad welfare state that isn't very generous and that's sort of chronically underfunded. And then you have minimal segmented welfare provision, where basically narrow regime coalitions didn't invest a lot in social policies in the first place, or very much limited it to key constituencies of the regime rather than the population at large. And these welfare regimes tend to be much less universalist in character. So access to social policies is much more linked to status, to a labor market status, and so on and so forth.
I mean, what you outlined there is kind of a broad structuralist theory of welfare states in the region, being driven by communal cleavages, elite cohesion, repressive capacity, external threats. And I wonder if there's something deeply pessimistic in that. I mean, given that these are things that don't tend to change that quickly. And I mean, one of the things that the data in your book shows as well is that welfare regimes in the region are incredibly sticky over time. And there's an enormous path dependency. Now, from the World Bank to the African Development Bank to all kinds of development actors across the world, we're spending enormous amounts of money, and so do development actors within the region, on trying to improve healthcare provision, trying to improve schooling and various welfare outcomes in the region. Are these attempts doomed from the start?
No, I wouldn't say so. And also, I mean, first of all, you're absolutely right. It is a structuralist theory, and this is probably also where some of its weaknesses lie. And I hope that, you know, others will take this and improve it, or, you know, reject part of it. I mean, scholarship is always sort of an ongoing process. But I see this sort of argument as the starting point of a debate, hopefully. But unlike you, I don't think the fact that it's structuralist means it's necessarily pessimistic, you know, because structuralist theories can also lock in good outcomes. When times get tough, that means that welfare regimes don't necessarily evaporate. So, for instance, that's something we've seen to some extent in the Tunisian case, where despite, you know, adverse conditions in the 1980s and early 1990s and big economic changes over time, and the advent of a whole new development model based on neoliberalism, many of the fundamental pillars of their welfare state haven't changed, and on the contrary, some of them have actually expanded and continuously included new groups. So in that sense, it really depends. You know, on what side of this initial regime formation process you end up with, whether you end up with a strong welfare state or not. But in terms of your question and sort of regarding policy interventions at a later stage, I would argue that they're necessarily more limited in their reach. You know, I mean, you don't build a whole institutional setup back from scratch. So what you very often end up with is institutional layering. So if you really think that the given institutions, say for instance about social protection, you wanted to do something about the informal sector, which very often is neglected, if you wanted to add sort of this to the existing institutional set up, very often you have to create sort of a new layer of institutions that has sort of a new mission and a new policy objective, which in that case would be, target informally employed workers. So yes, the extent to which you can sort of fundamentally shift social policy trajectories becomes much more constrained at later stages of development and sort of way past regime formation. Critical junctures are rare, and that's a good and a bad thing depending on the outcome, I think.
I really want to get to the critical junctures, given that we might be living through one of them right now. But I'll add in one more question on the kind of wider argument of the book. In general, one of the things I found quite striking in it was that one of the actors that we would imagine to play a large role in the region when it comes to pushing for welfare provision is markedly absent in it. There's relatively leftist parties, communist parties, socialist movements in the region, which have a large history in the region, don't come up in the narrative that often, and don't feature as a central part of the of those kind of wider trajectories and setting countries on these trajectories that you outline. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role that you think that leftist parties have had in welfare state provision in the region.
I think it's been very limited, and I'm not sure I entirely agree with your premise. I mean, certainly leftist parties have a long history, but it's not necessarily a history of strength. I mean, I don't know many countries in the region that have sort of produced long-lasting, well-organized leftist mass parties with strong, regional representation and branches and so on and so forth. The only kind of left-wing actor in the region that has over time consistently been able to do this is the UGTT in Tunisia, sort of as a labor union. But in terms of parties, the region has very often been characterized by generally weak parties, and even more so sort of left-wing parties, which have been, for instance, more weakly organized than Islamist parties, for instance. So I think there is something to be said about institutional weakness of the left, although ideologically the left was very important, but institutionally and in terms of organization capacity, it's been a rather weak actor. And this is partly also to do with the fact that it was historically the key opposition to nascent authoritarian regimes. So what rulers did is that they tried to suppress any left-wing actor that had organizational and mobilizational capacity. And what we see in the region at the moment is partly a legacy of that process. But it also has to do with sort of long-term structural factors, such as patterns of commodification. I mean, as opposed maybe to Latin America, the labor and sort of the working class in the region was never fully commodified, and sort of certainly not in the way it was in OECD countries. So the process of class formation itself differed from other places, so that in many countries you didn't have this kind of pool of a very strong cohesive working class that could have mobilized, even if it would have wanted to. And sometimes the same factors that led to, narrow coalitions also divided the left. So if you take sectarian divides, they in some countries they also tended to divide working class actors. So I think on the whole there is sort of a bunch of factors that made sure that the left wasn't a sort of a key actor in the establishment of different welfare regimes. And when it comes to rulers' ideologies, in my view, I'm quite skeptical of their significance. I mean, in the two case studies on Nasser's Egypt and Bourguiba, what really comes out from sort of the sources that I looked at is that both of them were first and foremost nationalists. So this was a true ideological stance that they took. Anything else afterwards was very much shaped by the coalitions and the actors in the coalitions that they built. And so at some point, for instance, it's very striking that Bourguiba was very much opposed to the sort of left-wing social policies that the UGTT was bringing into the ruling party. But in a way, he could only delay certain delay this, or sort of try to attenuate some of their ambition. But he couldn't fundamentally change it because he had to rely on the UGTT as a key sort of constituency in the ruling coalition. So much about sort of the left in the region. But yeah, overall quite skeptical of its significance.
I mean, if you alluded to it earlier, if welfare regimes are sticky and critical junctures are rare, this might be a particularly important time to start thinking about critical junctures. We're doing this podcast on Zoom as the UK is still on lockdown due to the ongoing corona pandemic. It has hit countries across the Middle East quite differently, and obviously these things are changing quite quickly, and numbers are unreliable. So anything we are talking about now might be out of date in a week. But the picture as it emerges so far seems to be that Iran has been hit quite early and quite hard with over 90,000 cases and over 5,000 deaths, I think, as of earlier this week. Saudi Arabia and Israel have both had a relatively high number of cases. North Africa has a somewhat lower number of cases that are reported, but a higher number of deaths. Obviously, there are issues with all these numbers. But we've also seen countries in the region react to this in instituting lockdowns, in instituting public policy measures to help people both financially and in terms of providing health systems with the resources they might need. But at the same time, diversity in health capacity has been quite visible. Now, I was wondering, as you followed these last couple of months in the region as well, has anything surprised you? Has anything struck you as unexpected in states' responses to this crisis?
Not fundamentally. In a way, I was almost positively surprised. And don't get me wrong, that the overall response to the informal sector hasn't been sort of is by far not sufficient. But I was surprised still to see that countries that very often tend to neglect their informal sector or securitize their informal sector in sort of an attempt to want to control it or see it as something potentially threatening. Once it becomes clear that the informal sector kind of matters, because it's in the context of a pandemic, the behavior of most people working in the informal sector will very much determine what the eventual damage is, for instance. That countries that have sort of previously not invested a lot of effort in sort of reaching out to the informal sector in terms of social policies have now actually shown some good initiatives, some creative ways of maybe targeting a sector that is difficult to, reach into. It at least requires more investment, and it requires more thinking, and the sort of political payoffs of doing this are not maybe as high as if you target, key middle-class urban constituencies who are, in the long run politically maybe deemed as more threatening or as more relevant, But for instance, there have been attempts in Morocco, to use mobile phone networks to reach out to the informal sector. Egypt has sort of tried to build certain, a database and a program where people can register and then draw on support. But at the same time, there's also shows that a lot still remains to be done, But if you want to look at sort of the glass half full side of things, it is clear that if political elites have an incentive to reach out to the informal sector, then policy solutions can be found. And sort of this seems to be sort of one of the more promising aspects of the crisis. To the extent, I don't know to what extent this will be lasting. I don't know what you think about this.
I mean, I thought it. I was thinking you have this beautiful line from, you referenced this line from Aristotle in your book, where you say that it's often more revealing to ask not by whom a regime is ruled, but for whom it is ruled. And a large part of the narrative in your book is around how regime constituencies can also teach us something about social welfare trajectories. And one of the somewhat incorrect issues around the crisis has been framed as this great equalizer, which of course it wasn't. It has hit people disproportionately, but it has hit people across society. And it's been, I think, really interesting to see that the informal sector, if you mention it, which in the region has so often been kind of demonized by regimes. It's been referred to, as the illoyal competition, as somehow in league with the terrorists and something that subverts the state, or as, the Maroc inutile, as the kind of the part of the economy that's not worth developing. Seeing governments focus more on this and expend some welfare provisions towards this, I think has been really positive to see. What I think is the $1 million question, and I think it goes along quite well with what you just said, is that the question is, does this translate into a change of the kind of regime constituency in the long term, right? Does this translate into more political voice in the long term? Does it translate into more universalist forms of provision? And maybe that's the second part of the crisis I'd love to hear from you about. I mean, the one is kind of the immediate reaction now, but also, unless something very dramatically happens with how debt is organized internationally, it seems quite likely that a lot of the countries in the region, both as a combination of the current expenditures, the global crisis, and the oil price, will be heading for a fiscal crisis in coming years. Do you see that as another potential turning point for welfare states in the region?
I'm not sure about that. What I'm sure about is that the fiscal crisis that will ensue is likely to undermine this formation sort of a broader coalition that you outlined. Because as you know, this idea of solidarity, sort of which emerges sort of as a feeling, maybe as a sort of an impulse amongst national elites and amongst the population at large, is something that you can initially rely on, but you need to somehow, in order to affect long-lasting change, this needs to be translated into something post immediate crisis, and this requires political entrepreneurs, and this requires a sort of I think, a willingness also on the part of those who've so far benefited mostly from public social policies in the region, i.e. urban middle classes, to some extent share these benefits. Now, during the pandemic, it makes sense because, as I said, the behavior of people working in the informal sector directly affects how people whether people in the formal sector will get it, whether the economy will suffer, whether lockdown will last longer or not. So this connectedness is really kind of created to some extent by the virus itself. Once this is over and we get into this distributional conflicts about who's going to bear the costs, very often, the chances are that we will likely fall back into sort of old patterns where sort of existing distributive coalitions will try to kind of safeguard their benefits. And if any of the kind of fiscal consolidation processes of the last 25 years in the region, which have in a way all failed to fundamentally change long-lasting patterns of growth, so much about sort of IMF structural adjustment, but if in terms of the fiscal aspect of it, if they've taught us anything, is that the costs have usually been disproportionately allocated to those with the least voice, those with the highest levels of vulnerability. I mean, the last Egyptian IMF program is a big case in point, with the increase of poverty, which the regime itself has acknowledged. And if this is going to be repeated in the sort of next decade, I don't see a big chance for sort of long-lasting changes of social policy regimes, because elites will primarily be focused on this, and everything will be about safeguarding existing benefits.
In a desperate turn to try to get a half glass full message out of you towards the end of this, you just pointed to the IMF, and again, as fiscal pressures are going to mount throughout the region, there might also be a renewed, in some cases, a new in some other cases, or a continued in a third group, engagement with international financial actors. Does that also change the kind of domestic discussion and internationalize it more? Are we going to see more region-wide discussions or a more international influence on welfare provision in the region?
I don't know, Max, why you come with the IMF if you want a glass half full message from me, but I do my best. I mean, I don't know. I mean, if we look at the past, I mean, the role of the IMF is well established. I mean, it seems to be a recurrent feature that every 5 to 10 years, the resource poor countries, or at least the labor abundant countries in the region, go through some form of IMF restructuring. So far, this hasn't really kind of internationalized the social policy debate, but I'm not sure, what do you actually mean by that? So what do you have in mind?
Well, I'm imagining that a lot of the discussion we had earlier, a lot of these long-term trajectories are kind of baked into national regime coalitions and into ethnic cleavages, political cleavages within the region. If these are now being renegotiated, even with an actor such as the IMF that has historically does not have a strong track record of strengthening social welfare provision in the region, I mean, it breaks up something and it opens up new possibilities. So I was trying to find if we could have any hint of positive change within that new negotiation. Yeah,
it bears sort of it brings the chance of a reshaping of certain coalitions, but fundamentally, I think these coalitions are domestic in nature, and I think this is not only a feature of the Middle East. I think that's also a feature, for instance, of Europe. I mean, I think organizing cross-national distributive coalitions and sort of mobilizing them effectively to, say, get something which looks like a more say an EU that has a stronger social policy component or has more solidarity, or sort of a Middle East that would have sort of a stronger social policy, framework. This is very difficult to organize across countries. So the ability to kind of, transcend the nation state there as the key kind of framework of reference is really difficult. And I certainly can't see the IMF being here the great game changer.
Yes, I think you've left us with a glass half empty, but a much better understanding.
I tried my best, but you threw the IMF at me. What can I do?
I think I knew what you were going to do with it, and I kind of wanted you to do that. But I think you've also provided us with a much better understanding of how historical trajectories are going to be important for understanding of what we're seeing in the region now. And for anyone who does want to look into that more, Social Dictatorships is out on Oxford University Press, and I would highly recommend it. Ferdinand, thank you so much for making the time and speaking to us today, even if it is in these difficult times and over Zoom.
Yeah, thank you very much, Max. It's been a great pleasure talking to you.
And you.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening. If you like this, then please subscribe and share. Between the Lines is a monthly podcast published the first Wednesday of every month. It's brought to you by the Institute of Development and Studies. Follow us on Twitter at IDS_UK or visit ids.ac.uk.